I'm going to introduce Lesson 2.5, Solving Equations and Inequalities. So on this first page is a lot to read, but important information here to keep in mind in terminology are the terms expressions, as we've talked about before, equations. So in this situation, we're going to be solving equations, and we only solve equations when there is an equal sign involved, where you have an expression equal to another expression with a variable, and then we go ahead and solve. I'm going to do an extra example here, but you can see one basic example from solving equations here, where we look at operations. Later on, we'll look at inequalities when it has inequality symbols. And again, usually with equations, we need to solve the equation. So important language as we go ahead. There are two kind of basic rules. We look at the additive property, and it works for subtraction, and then multiplicative, which works for division, where you can see if you have a number equal to a number or some value, if you add the same number, it does not change the fact that this two would be equal to each other. I just want to do one simple demonstration of that. Everyone knows this is trivial, 5 equals 5. But if you add 2 to 5, you end up with a true. They're both true, and that's the important piece about it. The equation looks different, but it's still true, and that's what allows us to do all of this work when we solve equations here. And so looking at this example here, when we solve an equation, especially as it gets more complex like these, the first thing you want to do is simplify each side of the equation. So there is definitely two sides of an equation. So I'm going to simplify this side. And some people actually draw a little line just to remind themselves that that you have two sides. And so in this case, the first thing we're going to do is combine like terms, 3x minus x. So you end up with 2x minus 4 equals. And on this side, we'd use distributive property. Again, we're trying to isolate the x. So then this becomes 6x minus 3. And so now you have a more simplified equation, but we got to continue on. Now I need to solve for x. And so I like to remove the variables first, but you don't have to. Some people would add 3 or add 4 to both sides. I'm going to do that. So I end up with negative 4. In this case, what you do to one side, you have to do the other to keep it balanced here. Negative 4, and then this is 4x minus 3. And so now the next step would be I need to isolate x, so you're going to go ahead and add 3 to both sides. And so in this case, you get 4x equals negative 1. And here a lot of students get a little like, oh, the numbers looks like it's going to be a fraction, or you do your division correctly. 4 times what equals negative 1? So just remember that you're actually solving a problem. 4 times what equals negative 1? And on this case here, to solve it, one way is to think it out, or just say, I'm going to divide both sides by 4, the coefficient. And so then you get x equals negative 1/4. And if we were going to check our work, you could plug that in, but for this video I'm not. But you would take this number and plug it in to see if you get the same answer. Just like you would do here, you plug in the 5, and you can check to see if you end up with, if this number makes both sides equal to each other here. But it's important to remember a common mistake here once we got to a mistake here. Once we got to here, negative 1 equals 4x, is to say x equals negative 4, because you divide the wrong way. But 4 times what equals negative 1? It has to be a fraction, so make sure you do not do that. Okay, and so for your discussion post, you're going to do these. Let's take a look at a few more problems here. Here's, we revisit what we did in the previous lesson. We have this equation or formula for tax owed depending on some income, and here are some answers to these questions here, where if the wage is $3,000, how do you find out how many taxes? You solve an equation, but we're doing that by plugging in here, and then you're getting an answer for taxes. So we're plugging in the wages into W here, and then you could do that calculation with a calculator and you get this. Now the harder question is, what if you know what the taxes are and then you need to find wages, which is happening here. So you can see in the setup here, you can see 3423.75 is equal to the equation, and now you have to solve for W. Now it's not, the numbers are in decimal, so maybe that's why it looks a little intimidating, but it's, again, you're going to add to both sides, and then you end up dividing using those rules from here, right? These are the basic rules that allow us to solve equations, and then you end up with that answer there. So that's our introduction to 2-5.